Hi, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and books. And today I'm joined by Stephen Erikson, who, if you would look up into camera, hi, Steve.
Hello. Sorry, you're interrupting something, reading.
Well,
Although this is the first time I've actually gone back to read this stuff.
so today, um, Steve Erikson has agreed. I've been doing prologue analysis and going through different sections of some of these books to try and pick out what I thought the author, the writer, was trying to convey. And sometimes people doubt me, and that's fine. I'm just a guy with a webcam. But today I'm joined by Stephen Erikson, so we can go through a section together just to talk about some of the interpretations of text, what's woven in, what he intended the connections to be, the things that I pick up on that may or may not be the same. And we're going to look at chapter 26 of House of Chains. So this is spoilers for House of Chains. It's spoilers for chapter 26. If you haven't read it, this is going to be an in-depth analysis of this and a discussion of this. So this would be heavy, heavy spoilers for the end of the book. That being said, Steve, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Bearing in mind that the author is dead and it was written in 2002, I'm going to have to resurrect that author and try to remember some of the things that I had going on. But I've always held that you can take any sections of these books and I can deconstruct them. You can fans. In fact, why don't we do something along those lines? Just set up a kind of a regular thing where fans can choose a section from a book, and you and I will then tackle it from our own perspectives and have a discussion on it.
Well,
So
okay.
I'm happy to open that invitation without even having asked you, but hey, there we go.
Well, I would add one little proviso to that. I'm doing a read through with Dr. Philip Chase, and because of that, I've only gotten up to House of Chains. So if we could turn this into a regular thing, I'm open to it. But if people could stick to where I am currently with the book that I've finished, that would really help me out, because otherwise I'm going to have to try and cram all of the rest of the Book of the Fallen in order to do these.
Oh, fine, whatever.
So if people in the comments want to leave a specific section or excerpt or bit of a chapter, a specific scene that they would like Steve and I to have a discussion about, to work through from any of the first four books. And then as I get further on through the series, we can open it up to books 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 as I get to them. How about that?
Oh, all right.
Is that slightly inconvenient for you, Steve? Having
I'll
to rely
say,
on my reading speed?
yes, absolutely. Knowing how slow you are as a reader, so.
You take that back. People on the internet will believe that.
Well, they'd be silly to do so.
Ah.
Believe things on the internet? Why would you do that?
Okay, so
chapter 26.
Chapter 26. So this is essentially what we're going to go through here is the death of Drishna as witnessed by Leoric, the death of Felison at the hands of Tavor, and there's a section with Karsa as well. That's when Karsa turns up to get Leoman, isn't it?
Yeah, it drags Leoman away.
Okay. So those are the three main sort of storylines here that we're going to be looking at. And we'll try and work through it sequentially. And then maybe do some backwards and forwards as we get down through it.
Sounds good.
Do you want me to start with, here's what the critic says, and then the writer can go, yeah, you totally missed that.
Yeah, I like that idea.
So looking at the very beginning, so we start with that epigraph of, on this day, where Raku rises. So immediately setting up, this is the big conference.
Raku.
Not in Northern Ireland, it isn't.
Yeah, that's true.
In the original Northern Irish accent of Genabacchus.
Yeah.
But this is immediately setting up, this is the confrontation, because this is what everything has been building towards. Not necessarily building towards the battle that, you know, has we've seen the armies moving, but the actual confrontation about it's the forces of Tavor versus the forces of Felasin. And obviously in this chapter, it boils down to the two of them rather than a big army battle. And we have the promise of Raku rising. So there's a foreshadowing event, which obviously in this chapter you subvert. Would that be fair to say?
Yep. Yeah.
Glad I invited you along then.
Yeah, though the whole notion of rising, of course, is echoing back to the flooded Nason at the very beginning in the prologue. So that's probably a spoiler for post House of Chains. That rising of Raku. It might be.
And not really, because this is echoing back to the prologue, an image from the prologue of the waters rising, of the silt building up, of the dam beginning to break, that the deluge will always happen after the first couple of cracks have formed. Where does the first crack form? That's here. That's in this chapter. That's the end of this book. This is the crack that starts the dam breaking.
Yeah.
So I think that ties in, and it ties in very neatly with what is evident in the beginning in the prologue, particularly because the nascent, like we are talking about Drishna trying to take a bit of Emerland, of trying to get a part of Shadow. So the fact that the nascent is there and referenced and the eater being referenced, that we have that nice thematic tying in.
Yeah, and technically I've always described that notion of elliptical writing, where you ring that bell early and then you come back to it. And when you come back to it, the tone is slightly shifted. The sound is slightly different. And this is kind of a good example of how I do it anyways. So everything starts in the prologue with the aftermath of a flooded realm, so destruction everywhere. And but even the epilogue ends with that notion of this is an unnatural circumstance, and nature will redress the balance. So the wall cannot hold. And so when you come back to it, the first thing I give you with the whirlwind goddess is the raging storm of wind and sand. So we've got the storm again, only it's obviously, it's not a storm triggered by the flood, but it's also a storm that against which things cannot stand. And so that's how these things are echoed structurally.
But you have that, the way that I talk about in terms of dyads or polar opposites. The storm at the beginning that had been referenced had been wet and warm and humid. This is dry and desiccated. That we've gone from the water to the desert. So there's that contrast between the two, and yet it's the similar theme that's being explored across both of them. Yeah.
And just as in the beginning, in this chapter and in the epilogue, or maybe the epilogue, I'm not sure, I haven't read that far. There are bodies on the shoreline, whether it's the shoreline of the desert or the shoreline of the flooded Nason.
And of course, like this book ends with Raku being flooded, the sea coming back.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure if it was in this section or in this book or not, or Bone Hunters. But yes,
I will put spoilers for House of Chains on this, because really, in order to talk about this, we kind of have to talk about the book as a whole and what's going on both ends. So,
honestly, I couldn't remember if I flooded Raku in Bone Hunters or if I flooded it here at the end of this book. And I'm relieved to discover I flooded it here in this book, because this is where it belongs. So
glad to see that your memory's worse than mine.
Oh God, it's dreadful for this. I mean, it's 2002, right? So it's the last time I ever looked at this thing.
So in this opening section where we're with Felasin's point of view, and one of the things that I find interesting about this is, although it's Felasin's point of view, this is very much the dropping away, the final dropping away of Felison's character, because we've seen that earlier on in the book where Felison had been becoming more callous, more cold, more cruel. And then when she'd walked into Hiboric's tent and Drishna was kept out, suddenly Felison came back to herself. And the first thing that she was concerned about was Felison the Younger, her adopted daughter. And when she walks back out, Drishna comes back suddenly. So we as reader see the drastic change that Drishna is imposing on Felison. And in this opening section, we see that what Drishna is doing is finally complete. Felison is basically, all she is now are memories to this vessel for the goddess's vengeance, for her rage. And even though Felison sort of is Shaik then, she doesn't understand that rage that the goddess is feeling, what it's based on, but she identifies with it because she has her own rage, her own vengeance. And so they are simpatico, which makes her the perfect vessel, because her rage and vengeance is focused on Tavor.
Yeah, and if you look structurally, so the opening paragraph is the whirlwind goddess. So we're at the goddess level. But the very next paragraph is entirely Felison's childhood memories. And so what happens is, when you're setting up, when you're opening a chapter, those opening sections, you can actually set up the rest of the chapter, almost paragraph by paragraph. And these are the places we're going to revisit in the rest of the chapter. And so I suspect I got that in early because I knew that the childhood memories for Felison were going to be central when we get to the final scenes of her final stand, as it were, once Drishna has been forcibly removed from her, so that she was going to revert back to the child that she once was. So that's why it shows up very quickly in the second paragraph. And I'm noticing immediately the opening of it is Felison had been her mother's name. So it's the first time we invoked her mother at all in this book. So the mother that Tavor and Felison share. And of course, you go a little bit further ahead and you can look at Felison's final line as she's dying. Let's see, where's it? There it is. You want to read that?
Well, I have to scroll down through this.
Oh, fine. Her last thought is, "Oh, mother, look at us now." So that's how everything sort of, again, pulls around. That whatever I set up here in the early parts of the chapter, I have to come back to. I'm obliged to come back to. And it's the most personal statement she could possibly make. And so that's why it shows up so early in this paragraph, or in this chapter, rather. Go on, though.
So one of the things that I wanted to know just about that opening, the young woman who had once been born, Felison of House Paran, who had become Shaik, chosen one, supreme leader of the army of the apocalypse. So that transition from Felison to Shaik, the vessel of the goddess's rage, is signaled very, very clearly there. But it's in the next two paragraphs that I think there's something quite interesting, which is this idea of vision, sight, being able to see. Because we have, she caught a glimpse of that girl, the smeared reflection from a polished mirror, a flushed wide smile and bright eyes in that second paragraph. And then in the third paragraph, her mother had been gifted with visions, and she had dreamed that she would have that too. So, and then in the fourth paragraph, again, the visions are now murky and fraught things. But this idea of sight, this idea of perception, this idea of the seeing of things, and whether you see them truly and clearly, or whether they are obscured and you're not seeing clearly. And I think that imagery that is signaled there, very much in context of what that is meant to be, ties in very neatly to Tavor wearing a helm that keeps her eyes free. She's seeing clearly. She sees her job, her duty, what she is doing. And Felison wearing a helmet that has bars across her eyes. Her vision is occluded. Her vision is obstructed. She is not seeing clearly because at this moment, being possessed by this spirit of vengeance, everything is being filtered by that. So she's not seeing things clearly. She's not prioritizing things clearly. And when we have that moment when Drishna dies, leaves her entirely, and Felison suddenly can see clearly, it's too late.
Yeah, but she's also trapped in the cage, right? She's behind bars. So in that sense, she remains a prisoner, which is kind of what sort of seals her fate, if you will. But then think back on the lines when Bowden dies, and she talks about her armor breaking away. And so this, I mean, she has literally put the armor back on for this, and it's insufficient to the task. In fact, if anything, it encumbers her.
So obviously we'll come down through that when we get to those sections, but it was just looking at this. You signal here in this opening about the visions and this description of the whirlwind in no uncertain terms: bitter with age, bilious with malice, sour taste of betrayal, a heart-piercing, very personal betrayal. And you go, really, Steve? That's a bit on the nose.
Well, because it's both of them, isn't it? It's both Drishna and Felison. They both experienced that. Yeah, it's on the nose, but we're at the end of the freaking book. So, and the thing is, if you're gonna, I knew that the final scene was going to be almost anticlimactic, and so I can't rush to it. I have to build very slowly, very incrementally towards it, because I know the tension is there in the reader, and I want to really hold that in check as long as I can. So, yeah.
And we also, well, in talking about building tension, like you even include things like step by step, we walk the most horrendous path, stride tottering along the edge of an unsuspected abyss. Companions see nothing amiss. The world seems, step by step, all of this is all language about moving forward slowly, about building toward this. So that's interesting that, you mentioned about trying to create this pace, and clearly like that next paragraph I was about to look at, her internal thoughts in this edition are in italics.
Yeah.
That it's signaling that very thing.
Yeah, and again, go back to the prologue. You talked about the rhythm of the sentences and the paragraphs as that rise and fall of the lapping waters. And in this case, and then of course, the prologue ends with a single individual deliberately abandoned by all of those who were once close to him. And of course, what's happened here is all of Shaik's followers have completely turned on her and are basically pushing her out there alone onto that place. And so that parallel is always going to come back at some point or another. But one of the things it allows you is that, when you're writing a novel, it can go anywhere. And that's always a risk, is that you let it go anywhere. And the opening of the novel, the prologue, whatever, is actually setting your own limitations as to where you want to go with this thing. So that prologue is there to establish the framework and the parameters of the imagery you want to use. And so that, in that sense, I'm kind of bound to it, but I knew where it was going. So when I get to this part, everything that was in that prologue is now a twisted, mirror darkly kind of version, mirror cracked. But it's still there. And that's what binds everything together within a book. And I think just for the psychological impact on a reader, whether they're conscious of it or not, that is something that actually contributes to a sense of satisfaction at the conclusion of a book.
Well, I know that even when I'm reading, even if I'm not picking up on everything that you do, and be able to explain to someone exactly what you have done or exactly what any author has done, there are certain things that I know unconsciously I am picking up on in the text that contribute to a sense of pacing or a sense of tone. That just looking at the end of this section, of this opening of chapter 26. She stood in the main chamber, the air that would be a throne, or the chair that would be a throne behind her, its cushions cool, its armrests dry. So we start with cold and dry, but it's empty. It's not particularly warm and welcoming. She stood imprisoned in a stranger's armor. So not only is that physically describing the scene in that she is wearing armor, like nice straightforward description, but it's a stranger's armor, and we know from Deadhouse Gates the armor that she had put round herself was her own personal armor that Bodin's death broke, and now a stranger's armor is engulfing her because it's Drishna's pain and suffering that she's being wrapped in. And then you actually double down on that by saying she could almost feel the goddess reaching out to engulf her on all sides. Not a mother's embrace, no, nothing like that at all. This one would suffocate her utterly, would drown out all light, every glimmer of self-awareness. So the armor is someone else's, let's say Drishna's pain, and this armor is embracing her and choking her. So it's not an embrace, it is a prison. It is something that is suffocating her, is drowning out all light. So again, we have that reference both to seeing clearly, being in shadow, being in darkness, and every glimmer of self-awareness is being hidden. So again, occluding the vision, occluding knowledge. Yeah. And we saw this when Drishna had temporarily left her in Haboric's chamber. And then to make it so explicit, you say, her ego is armored in hatred. She cannot look in. She can barely see out. Like, you spell it out so literally here.
Well, yeah. Let's go back to that paragraph. Well, both of them. She stood in the main chamber. What I'll do is I'll talk about it in terms of sentence pattern, sentence structure. Your average sort of workshop editor might look at, she stood in the main chamber, blah, blah, blah. She stood imprisoned in a stranger's armor as repetition of the phrase she stood. And the sentence structure is identical all the way through. I start with she for all three of those first sentences. But that is deliberate. And there's a kind of a psychological impact to repetition of sentence structure, that it's like it's hammering something home. It's like the hit of the hammer on the nail is the same each and every time, with slight variations. So the first one, the clause is she stood in the main chamber. So I tie it into where the setting is. And so it's a physical attribution. So she stood in the main chamber. Very simple, you can picture it. The second time I use it, she stood, I go straight to the abstract. So I need the comma there. She stood, comma, as if I'm repeating what I just said, but no, we're not in the chamber anymore. Now we're trapped in a stranger's armor. And so that's how you can move from the concrete to the abstract. And you can make it seem recognizable, familiar, unjarring, simply by doing that repetition of the sentence structure, because they become familiar now. They become almost rhythmic as you go into the paragraph. But you can then do those twists all the way through, where you move from the concrete to the abstract, and shift it out. So,
and I think this is a vital point, because a lot of people, and I was told this, when I started as an undergrad, it's like, don't have repetition, don't do this thing,
man,
because
yes.
this is the rule. You must do this. But the thing with rules in writing is it is a guideline, because if you do it this way, you get a certain response. But as with anything, you find out that it's not so much a law as it's just guidance. And the reason is, once you understand it, you know what happens when you break it, and you know how to break it.
Yeah.
Because as a general rule, yes, avoid word repetition unless you are actually going for the effect that word repetition creates.
Exactly, which is very poetic, right? It's more poetic than prose. So, and yeah, I mean, and then so it's all she, and then we go later to her, and of course with her, even though it's an internal thing, so we know that it's Felicin thinking about Drishna, or Shaik, whatever you want to call her. It's also the author saying, look at Felicin as her, right? So it's both. And that's what you can do with point of view in that sense, is that when the character internalizes their thoughts, or rather we see their internalized thoughts, the subject can be very, very elusive. It can appear to be one thing, but entirely the other, or it can appear to be more than one thing. So it's a commentary on Felicin, even that she's not conscious of, but the reader picks it up.
Yeah, and the other thing I think is that's good to point out here is it's not just that there's only one way to read this. Like, some of this is like, you might have intended a lot of those things. Like, you've spoken very clearly about what you intended. I wouldn't have picked up on all of that, but I would have picked up on some of it, and I would have felt some of it, even if I was unaware of how you did it, until like sitting and picking it apart to actually try and explain it to someone else. But when you read, you just pick up on these things. So there's various levels of it, and sometimes it works the way I think you intended, and other times it doesn't quite work the way that you intend, but that's fine. Like, no author, no writer is perfect. You cannot, unless you had a text that had big red arrows and explanatory notes down the side of all of it, there's no way you can communicate everything that you were thinking or feeling or wanted to say with this. And if an author did that, that's very intrusive, because it's denying the reader agency and the experience of actually reading and trying to engage with what you have created. Yeah. But in a setting like this where the two of us are talking, this is about exploring those things. So this is not you saying to a reader, you must read it this way, or
No. And in fact, what I'm trying to get across is sometimes the rhythms you set up in your sentence patterns will do the job for you. And it's a very, very subtle way of doing it. If you look at that, her internal paragraph there, her ego is armored in hatred. She cannot look in, she can barely see out. So again, it's like the repetition of the sentence structure is exactly the same all the way through. Her walk is a shamble, her teeth gleamed in the shadows. So it's just one after another. And there's a comfort that it's in the mind there. It becomes easy to fall into that rhythm of reading, because it's like, it's repeated. But each time it's repeated, there's a slight, you're adding to it in some fashion or another. So, I mean, the purpose for me as an author is that, yeah, I want to slip this stuff through you as you read. But I'm always leading up to, a line that's going to sort of bring it back home. In this case, hold this mirror up at your peril. Because this is Felicin and Shaik looking at each other, right? That's what's happening so far. We've gone back and forth. As you say, Felicin's point of view is occluded, obscured, and it's bound to get worse. So,
and actually, just on that second last paragraph, one of the lines that I really, really like is, she cannot look in, she can barely see out. Mm-hmm. The rhythm of that pattern it's one of those ones I think you actually pick up better in audiobook than you do reading, unless you you sub vocalize, or you internally vocalize reading,
Which I do as I write. Yeah.
Which you do as you write, but it gets to the stage where I would actually have to slow down my reading in order to do that, because when I used to read, it was almost like I was hearing the words in my head. But now when I'm reading, particularly when I'm working or when I'm editing, I'm not sounding the words out individually in my head. I'm just reading. But then that's why you do multiple passes when you edit. You don't just go, oh yeah, that's it, done. But something like that, she cannot look in, she can barely see out. That you get that rhythm to it, and then her teeth gleam in the shadows, repeating the same thing, but it is a rictus grin, which ends slightly short. So it's slightly unsettling when you've set the rhythm up, which is a really nice little thing. Whether you intended for that to be unsettling at the end or not.
Well, of course it is. It's a rictus grin. Of course it's unsettling and intended to be. Yes. It's funny because she cannot look in can finish with a full stop. And the next line would be she can barely see out. But that has a different psychological effect to the reader. And I didn't, there are times when you just don't want that full stop. And so you kind of have to mess with grammar and proper sentence structure.
Yeah, well, it's not an essay. It's not formal writing in the sense of an essay or an article where you're meant to have formal writing. This is literature. It is an artistic expression of writing. So poetry, prose, drama, they all have general sort of approaches to them, but it's all about manipulating the English language and expecting it to conform to formal reportage is, I think, perhaps the wrong expectation for writing in a novel.
I think so, because, and it's the poetic side of things. If you can have a sentence that actually, in its clauses, actually can go from one extreme to the opposite, I find those to be very effective. So that sentence is, look in, see out. So it's the two opposite things. And yet it's all in one sentence. If you put a full stop in the middle of that, you screwed it up, because it's no longer the case, right? They're both declarative statements, but there's more of an effort to link the two for the reader. But you put a comma in there and you got in and then out. So, and it couldn't have been out then in, because that's the wrong direction we're going in this narrative. So,
so the next section is about Leoric. And
you mean Loric?
Loric.
Sorry. Go on.
No, fine. You talk about it. I'm done. Leoric. It's a glottal stop because of an apostrophe. Leoric. So Leoric. What, actually, answer me this. What is it about fantasy names of bloody apostrophes?
Well, yeah, but I mean, what is it about, whatever? I mean, there's an apostrophe in there, isn't there?
Oh, dear. So, Leoric. Actually, or maybe he's French. Logic. Logic could just make out the dog slayer positions. While he was enjoying a very nice Bordeaux.
Well, I could have made him Lautrec, but then there'd be too much to lose.
Oh.
Anyways, go on.
No, that was just painful, Steve.
I know.
So I
do it way too often, which is why my wife threatens divorce almost daily.
Yeah, in her defense, she has a point.
I know she does. Very sympathetic.
Sorry about that. So this section, this is more, when I was thinking of this chapter, I always think more about Shaikh Fellison, Drezhna, and Tavor. That's what I think of this chapter.
Sure.
So on the one hand, this is an unwelcome intrusion to me as reader, that I'm not interested in what Lorik is doing here. I want to get on with the conclusion, and this is forcing me to delay that gratification of seeing the conclusion, so I can understand the insertion. Then also there's the fact that, yes, this is actually setting up what's going to happen to Drishna, that we need a witness to that. Yeah. And that is partially being set up here as well.
Yeah, it's also setting up the actual environment in terms of the camp and the army, where it's positioned and all the rest. Yeah.
And again, you have like this tortured fragment of curled Emerlan was awakening. So it's like all of the references that we see to shadows, to darkness, to murkiness, all of those things. Darkness had been defeated somehow. He wondered at that, but not for long. There was no time for such idle musings. This tortured fragment of curled Emerlan was awaking, and the goddess was about to arrive to claim it for herself, to fashion a throne, to devour Raku. So again, that repetition that we were just talking about,
yeah,
that you do that to, well, you get that sense of it hammering home a point, of being very explicit, of making sure that the reader doesn't miss this. And yet that seems almost the antithesis of like your stated goal of show, don't tell. That here, this is very much telling.
Yeah.
And I think it's because when we talk about show, don't tell, and I think I can't put words in your mouth, but when I talk about show, don't tell, and that's a common approach that you have in these books, it's not everything has to be show, don't tell, because that would be a very difficult read. That authors and writers who use that technique always soften it slightly. It exists on a spectrum of tell, don't show, show, don't tell. All writing falls somewhere between, and it's not static. It's not a static position. It will move depending on sentence, paragraph, section, scene, chapter.
Yeah. And one easy way to sort of think about it is there may be a character who requires for them to proceed in the story to tell themselves as opposed to show, right? Because if you think, if you try to translate show, don't tell into a character's actions, well, a character fighting, it's all show because it's all too fast for anything else, right? It's your body memory, muscle memory, and all that kind of stuff. Your training, everything else. So that just has to exist. It's shown. But a character trying to, in their mind, place themselves in this circumstance and figure out where they are in relation to everything else around them, they will tell themselves the things that they think needs to be told. You know what I mean? There's two different things going on there. So this is Lorik. I mean, he lays out the environment, he lays out the setting for us, but then he tries to create the meaning behind it by telling himself to fashion a throne, etc. And so that hard consonant, or the two, is, you know, it's kind of, he's kind of basically making his list in his head, with the progression of this list. And then very next paragraph, when I use ghosts, well, ghosts are ephemeral. They're sort of, there's no hard edges to a ghost. And so if you look at the sentence structure of that line, ghosts still swirled in the shadows, it's all soft. Everything's soft in that one, right? So that's the kind of contrast you can do with your word choice when you're messing around with a particular point of view.
Yeah, actually, curiously, just looking at that now, I hadn't noticed quite how much sibilance was in that.
Tons, yeah.
And even extending into the next sentence as well. So you have ghosts still swirled in the shadows, warriors and soldiers from scores of long dead civilizations, wielding strange weapons, their bodies hidden beneath strange armor, their faces mercifully covered by ornate visors.
Yeah.
They were singing.
Yeah.
And I honestly, I hadn't picked up on all of that sibilance. And yet,
it continues, right?
yeah.
The song had grown pensive, morning, sighing soft as a wind. It had begun to rise and fall, a susurration that chilled Lork. So yeah, it's all, that's the ghosts, right? That sibilance is all about that kind of, yeah, there's no edges. There's no edges to this at all.
And weirdly enough, I wouldn't have described it that way, because I would have looked at that. Now that I've noticed it, I would have gone, well, the ghosts are swirling in the shadows. So this is misty and ephemeral, and it's the sound of the wind. It's that strange half sound that is swirling all around Lehoric as he's walking. That this is, he's entering into Emerlan, he's entering into Shadow, he's entering into this ghost world, as well as it being the physical world. So we're seeing the meshing of the two realities.
Yeah.
Looking at it now, that's where I would go with that.
Sure. And the next bit is who, why, what, right? Change the order of all of those, and it doesn't work. So there's always a progression that one has to sort of take in set and structure and your choice. Yeah.
Well, you could do, what do they want? Who will they fight for? Why are they here at all? That order would still work.
Yeah. Let me see why I didn't do that. Who will they fight for? Why are they here at all? What do they want? Well, it goes from the specific to the general, in a sense of.
But if you resequenced it, you would have, what do they want? Because it's, what are these things? Like, what are these things doing here? What do they want? Then, who will they fight for? Because they're warriors. And then, why are they here at all? Questioning their mere existence. You could still have that chain of thought would still follow a logic. But I
don't know. I mean, who will they fight for makes it immediate in the sense of, are they allies or are they enemies? Right. So there's immediate threat. Why are they here at all? I mean, are they going to fight? I mean, I made the assumption in the previous question, but I have to now question that assumption. And then what do they want is the utterance of questioning the assumption of the previous one. So I think that's why it's in that particular order.
Yeah, I can see that logic. But again, it's one of those ones I can look at and go, you could reorder that and you'd still have a logical sequence. Yeah. But, I see your logic. Don't always agree with it. Weirdo.
And it allows for the last sentence there to be the shortest, which I often like in a paragraph.
Okay.
And it's got nice alliteration. So
yeah. I love that was now gathered in this place, the cusp, where the prologue began with the nascent, and now we're in the cusp. And again, it's this element of Emerlan, it's this element of Shadow, it's a world that is being affected by a warren, which of course, we saw in the prologue. All of these things, very, very similar in what they are, but coming at from a slightly different angle, approaching the same thing that was in the prologue, but in an unexpected way, or applying it in a way that isn't an identical repetition. Yeah,
and it's such a lovely word, cusp, because it's both hard and soft, right? It's really nice.
And it's I have to admit now, this is going to sound silly, and I am assuming you never intended this, but the Toblakai's horse was a jag, and I always in my head imagine Karsa riding around in one of those stately Jaguar cars. That it's the Rolls Royce, it's the Jaguar of horses.
Well, of course it is. Everybody knows that.
But I just imagine then the little mounted jaguar thing on this horse's head.
Yeah, I mean, my version here is the Toblikai's horse was a Jag, type E. It's all good.
Well, I wouldn't want to be sticking the petrol pump hose thing into it in any particular orifice.
You'd only do it once, I'll tell you that.
But it's interesting. Huge and magnificent in its primal savagery, loping collected and perfectly proportionate to the giant astride its shoulders. So the way that the horse is being described in exactly the way that you could describe Karsa.
Yeah.
And then pointing out that perfectly proportionate to the giant astride its shoulders. You go, yeah.
Yeah, but then I undermine it immediately. Keep going.
And that giant was a mess.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things that I like, that you have this idea of things getting set up and then a contrast or an immediate way to very directly undermine them. So it's not accidental. It's not when you look where a writer has said something and then in the next sentence you go, that contradicts what you previously said. Not contrasts, contradicts. Yeah. And I think that's the difference, that contrasting something is deliberate, contradicting something, which you can use to effect depending on circumstance. But quite often when you see a contradiction in the text, that signals a mistake.
Yeah, yeah. You can certainly use contradiction a lot in dialogue, yes, no kind of thing.
No, you can't.
There you go. But in this case, yeah, but again, it's tied to Lorik's point of view. So that's where the judgment comes in. Karsa appearing to be a mess. And then I give the details of what that mess meant. So.
I do like the fact that Lorik is stunned that Karsa's not only killed the Daragoth, but dragging the heads behind him.
Yeah, he's one weird fucker, isn't he?
You just imagine what that was like, because obviously Lorik knows what the Daragoth are. He understands the threat of these hounds. And he sees this guy coming towards him, who he knew was a tough guy. He knew was a powerful warrior, and goes, oh, holy shit. He's so much tougher than I thought. He killed 2 of those things.
And it's already been set up, because I think earlier on we have Kalam and Quickben watch that fight sequence, don't we? And they both look at each other and say, let's get out of here. It's like, so it is set up in that respect. Yeah.
And it's we've seen that with multiple Leosin characters. So for instance, the 4 Leosin characters meeting up with Unra Control, and after the it's not a cusser, is it
could be sharper cusser, something.
But one of the munitions, and they're like, yeah, let's go and do this other thing. That the number of times Leosin arrogance is challenged in this by this new world order that they do not understand, becomes a running theme. And in fact, Esselmont picks up on it in Return of the Crimson Guard really, really neatly. He has some very nice moments in that deal specifically with this. But it's interesting that we see that from Lorik here, who we do have sympathy for. He isn't the typical arrogant Leosin. At least not to the same extent, and it's because we know him and we've been with him and we've experienced stuff with him, so we're more forgiving.
Yeah. Yeah, and where we leave him, well, we'll get to it when we get to it, but yeah.
But so a lot of this, there's this nice exchange with Karsa, and there's not a huge amount here that I want to go into. Like, it's a fairly straightforward exchange that's building on the stuff that we've previously talked about because we kind of end up, the goddess is coming, is almost here. It's too late for that, Leoman. Moments from being too late for everything.
Yeah.
But
I mean, there's a lot of, even though it's Lorik's point of view, there's a lot of Karsa's characterization is really coming through. Dead, I forgot to tell you some things. I mean, it's classic Karsa, isn't it? I killed him and I killed Bidithal and I would have killed Ghost Hands. I kill. Yeah, creates his list.
But that's where you have the slaughtered, all of them. It's a way of exploring, because we've seen so much of Karsa from Karsa's perspective. It's a way of exploring Karsa from an external perspective to see how other people view him. And
that's how you can elevate a character. Yeah.
Particularly when we've seen Karsa speaking before and doing these things, because we've been resting with his perspective, we've gotten his thought process, we've understood it. Now that we're seeing it from the external, where we get this list of, I did this and we've just done this, it's very abrupt. And suddenly when you can't see into his head, you can't see his thought process, you realize how everyone else is perceiving him. So it is nice to get that change of perspective. Where, and obviously in Deadhouse Gates, he was only external and strange and didn't even have a name.
Mm-hmm.
And yet here, he's gone back to being Toblakai because that's how Leoric knows him.
Yeah.
And yet we know him as Karsa.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's even a nice signal within the text that although we know it's Karsa, the perspective is from Leoric, and therefore the character is called Toblakai. Yeah.
Hold close to point of view for sure. And people sometimes complain that, well, how come you got characters with different names? Well, it's all down to the various points of view and how they see that character. And so it's actually an easy way to remind the reader that there's other ways of seeing this character.
And the other thing that I always find strange about that particular complaint is, my family call me by one name, my friends call me by another name, the people I work with may call me by a different name.
Yeah, I call you Hoser, so there we go.
And people I cut off in traffic have certain names for me as well. There are different names applied in our daily lives. Friends may have nicknames for us, other friends may not. That to impose, particularly that as if everyone has a single name, that we are all Prince or Madonna or
no.
As if there's only one. And yet that is a weird thing about fantasy, that so many characters have only one name, and it's across the genre. It's not any one particular author. It just seems to be one of those genre tropes.
Mm-hmm.
So then we have this, at the end of this, we have it signaled that the goddess is coming, is almost here. They clambered over the crest, and there stood Shaik, helmed and armored, her back to them as she stared southward. Leoric wanted to cry out, for he saw what his companions could not see. I'm not in time, O gods below. And then he leapt forward, his warren's portal flaring around him, and was gone. So we have this moment of the slight humor of meeting Karsa, but we're brought back into the tension of what is happening here, of what is building. And what is building? They're clambering over a crest as we're building to this moment. So we have that action mimicking tension. Yeah,
I think that early on they're at the base of a hill as well, aren't they? So it's all climbing its way up. Yeah.
And it's signaling that they're coming up. They see Shaik from the back. And of course, the next section now goes into Lorik's disappeared into his warren to the magical realm to see the goddess, and that's the section that we transition into. So the space between paragraphs here is actually that transition.
Yes.
Which is neatly done. It's a nice structural way to do it. But I also quite liked helmed and armored, her back to them as she stared southward. So again, this idea of seeing, but her back to them, because we know it's signaling her followers aren't with her at her side.
No,
They are behind her and an exposed back. A lot of this has been about betrayal. A lot of this has been about a knife in the back.
Yep.
All of that is being signaled here.
Yeah, and it's cinematic as well. I mean, I tend to write very cinematically, but of course I'm the only one seeing the film, so it's my job to actually describe what I'm seeing. So yeah.
And also, it's like, I know you have a love of westerns, and so that desert-like plain and the lone figure standing there staring out with the massive sky, and then the color, the ochre sort of background, like that's a very iconic Western image. And of course, Westerns thematically are usually about these individuals, and they're brutal, most of them.
Yeah, and often they involve betrayal. The good Westerns will involve some form of betrayal. Yeah.
So, and here we get, now this, I think, is quite often overlooked, but is this wonderful moment where suddenly we find out who this goddess is, what her background is, and how it connects to a whole load of other stuff.
Yeah.
So these are the goddess's memories. And of course, she's remembering Onrak's betrayal, Onrak sleeping with Kalava. All of this is spelled out here. Well, maybe not spelled out, because I don't think she uses the name Onrak or the name Kalava. But it is clearly evident, because we've had Onrak tell this story from the other perspective. And we know who Kalava is because we saw her in Memories of Ice. And so from the prologue of Memories of Ice, where Kalava had a very significant impact on the events of Memories of Ice, all the way through to now, that character that, oh, that's a throwaway character, oh, that's not important. This sort of ties into this idea that there are events that happen in history that at the time you cannot predict their repercussions. And it is only retrospectively that we look back in time and we create the linkages and we create the story, which very neatly fits.
Something Greek myths and Greek plays, really used a lot of. So, yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is this is one of the reasons why I like the narratological concept of story as the chronological resequencing of events to create meaning. And that's why I look at this in terms of story, because we look back at all of these disparate events. And, this is a technique for the whole of the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
Yeah.
You can look at these as disparate events, but when you get to the end, you get to look back at all of them and then reconstruct them to find the points of connection and linkage to go, there's the story. Whereas I think quite often now, particularly in modern narratives, story is used for almost synonymously with plot, and this idea of narrative events. That plot, story, what people tend to mean by that now is sequence of narrative events that are focalized on a single outcome.
Yeah.
Which to me is a very narrow interpretation of what narrative is. And it's a different interpretation of what story is. And of course, plot is generally the order in which a sequence of events are presented within a narrative. That's what we mean by plot in narratological discussions.
Mm-hmm. So
the reason we have all those different words is because narrative is complex. And I think a lot of the modern interpretation of, this section could be trimmed because it doesn't serve the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and everyone is entitled to their opinion about what they enjoy and don't enjoy within a book. This is not to negate that opinion. But if you only think of narrative events as being the only important things in a narrative, you lose the narrative satellites. Because we talk about kernels and satellites. Kernels are events that have to happen, otherwise the narrative cannot occur.
Yeah.
Satellites are events that happen that add depth, meaning, complexity, texture, subtext to a narrative to give it a uniqueness and a flavor. Otherwise, we'd just be left with Vladimir Prop's Morphology of the Folktale, and every story would follow that. Or Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, and every story would follow that. If that's all people wanted from it, the range of stories being told and how they are told would become very, very narrow.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, no, of course, the other thing which then brings us back to the opening of the book is the fact that she's carving the likenesses of her memories, either in wood or stone, which of course goes right back to the faces in the rock as well. So again, you know, you're mining, or I was mining the opening of the novel for my images at the end of the novel. So,
but we also have that this a look she could never forget. So going back to that recurring symbol of vision, but this is a vision from the past that is obscuring her vision of the present, and
of course it's the emotions underlying all that she won't let go of, right? Yeah.
So vengeance was a beast long straining at its chains. Vengeance was all she had ever wanted. Vengeance was about to be unleashed. So that point you'd made earlier on about repetition. Yeah. And here we actually see, and this was something that surprised me, and even Raku could not stop it. The children would die. So we'd had children were dying as one of the big lines from Deadhouse Gates. And now we're seeing the counter to that, which is children would die, which obviously is the antithesis of what we want to have. But we have a separation between Drishna and Raku, whereas up until now, the whirlwind goddess, Raku, Drishna, Shaik, they'd all very much been one nebulous entity. But now we see it being split apart as we get closer and closer in, that we see that they are made up of these different parts. And these different parts have different desires.
Oh, it's all personal when it comes right down to it. Yeah.
And you can then expand that outward to look at Shaik's camp, where, yes, it's the army of the whirlwind, it's the army of Shaik, and yet it's headed by, well, it's all these different people, and they all have different agendas, and they're all working in different ways. That we get this upward and downward motion of this thing recurring almost fractally, that this is being explored in the different levels.
Exactly, yeah. And we've just had, you know, Shaik's exposed back. That's the last sort of image previous to that, right? So this is all leading up to the betrayals that are coming, for sure.
And of course, all of this is being discussed behind her back. And this is about a betrayal. This is about Onrak betraying his wife, Drishna, with Kalava. And Onrak betraying his clan by making the picture of Kalava.
Yeah.
And
again, I'm going to keep harping on this, but mining the opening of the book, where there's the whole talk of Karsa going to hunt and kill children. And of course, we realize now that, you know, when you're reading the book, the children, of course, are just adult humans. But then here is Drishna, Shaik, who also uses the word children in the same sense as Karsa did. It's exactly the same. They're not children. They're the children of the Thalana Mass, right? So,
and even then, we're not even necessarily talking about the physical children and so begat so-and-so. We're talking about the inheritors, the children, the followers, the younger race that grew up. Because it is, when reading ordinary sort of literary fiction, because it's set in the real world, quite often you read literally, and then when something stands out, you go, that's probably symbolic or metaphorical. That actually becomes more difficult in fantasy because are things literally dragons, or is it the metaphor of a dragon? You know, and when you have a sequence like this, it is very easy to read it literally, that go, oh, she means the children of Onrak and Kalava. And of course, if we think back to Memories of Ice, that prologue, Kalava was able to breastfeed the two Jagat children, suggesting that she'd had kids. But was that immediately after? Is it some reference to Kalava and Onrak then? Well, was it? I don't know.
Are you asking? I thought you were being rhetorical.
No, I'm asking.
Yes, of course, it's a reference. So yeah, this is the thing where you can, if you're going to be driven by hatred, okay, you first have to personalize it, and then you depersonalize it. So it goes from the specific to the abstract. And so the hatred of one becomes the hatred of all. And it could be, ethnicity, religion, you name it. And so it's a progression that one has to do if one wants to actually dehumanize the other. And so this is certainly a case. Don't forget, she's she's half mad at this point. The vengeance has driven her mad. And so she's conflating the two. She's constantly mixing up the two. The notion of humanity as the children of the Talana Mass, and Kalava and Onrak's children, and it's all these things just all wrapped together, and that's what sort of provides the bars of the cage, if you will, that keeps her trapped.
And what's interesting is this section finishes with, she could see the path opening, the way ahead clear and inviting, a tunnel walled in spinning, writhing shadows. It would be good to walk again, to feel warm flesh and the heat of blood, to taste water, food, to breathe, to kill.
Yeah, again, the repetition,
So, but we move from, she's been imprisoned by her vengeance. She sees a way out of it. She sees the tunnel that's going to lead her from the darkness. And it's, oh yes, it would be good to walk again, to feel the sun on my skin, to eat food, to drink, to breathe. And then it finishes with to kill. And it's the circular coming right back to her vengeance.
Her vengeance.
Her need to inflict pain. And murder is the thing dictating all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, so the next section is my little callback to Hiborik and who is it? Hiborik and somebody else. The two warriors who first found me. Okay. So Leoman and Toblikai. I'm assuming.
Well, it's Shaik made her way down the slope. She's on her own. She's walking out into the middle of this field of battle on her own. And it was understood then, as she had known it would be. Vague distant shouts behind her. She smiled. Of course, in the end, it is the two warriors who first found me. So the two there were three up there. There was Toblikai, there was Leoman, and Lorik, and Lorik's just disappeared. Because he's now in the fragment of shadow. So it's Toblikai and Leoman.
Yeah, it has to be. Yeah.
But that's Shaik's memory.
Yeah, but it also it kind of echoes. When I first read it, I thought, wait a minute, is she referring to Hiborik and Bodin? And so I suspect that that's not accidental, but I can't remember for the life of me. So,
so on the literal level, I read this basically much more literally, as it was just the two are on the hilltop. And what stuck out to me then was, that's not Felison's memory. That's Shaik's memory of when Felison became Shaik. Yeah. So for me, it was further evidence that her character had been subsumed, that she was no longer Felison. But there is that nice parallel, obviously, to Bodin and Hiborik, which I hadn't thought about. I was foolish to have doubted them. And I know either one would stand in my stead. It's interesting, this assumption of leadership, this assumption of responsibility. the fight belongs to me and the goddess. So Shaik, even though she's been taken over completely by this entity, still thinks of Shaik as a different entity to the goddess. And we've seen that the goddess is in the fragment, but she's the personality that's overriding all of this. So you have that complexity of, it's not clear cut that this is one person or only these people. There's this melding and commingling of concepts.
It has to be, because that's why I do not mention the names, right? Because that makes it more obscure, a bit more ambivalent, what she's referring to.
And that's, I mean, if you were going for clarity, and if you'd wanted to make it clearer, you could have. So, like, this is ambiguous. This is giving that sense of confusion. Yeah. And I'm glad to hear that that was deliberate, because so then we move on to Keneb entering to discuss things with Tavor.
Just a quick comment on that. In terms of, for writers working on their work, transitions are pretty crucial in terms of how you want things to proceed. And sometimes, I'm looking at this, and the next section opens with enter, and we are entering the entire arena of the final scene. So that kind of works. And then I pause outside, but only indicate that he's pausing outside a command tent, but that's implicit in the enter. So it's one voice, but it's not Captain Kenneth's voice. And so sometimes when you're doing those things, check for your transition. Sometimes you don't need to set it up. You can actually trust in the reader to work this up, to work it out. And I remember from workshops that quite often an instructor would hand a manuscript back saying, I've deleted the first paragraph and a half because it starts here. And for writers, quite often we start too early, and it's a thing you have to sort of learn as you practice, as you continue writing. Sometimes, we have to find our feet, and then we write that out, and then realize when you go back and to do your edit that you didn't have to start that far back. You can start right at this moment. So,
well, I would point to this as when you do this really well, because you have enter, so someone's speaking. Then we have Captain Keneb, so we get our point of view, so we know who we're with. Seeking to collect himself, then he strode into the command tent. So now we have the physical location, the command tent, and also an implication of who the person spoke was, as she was donning her armor, so you're playing the pronoun game. A mundane task that would have been easier with a servant at hand, but that, of course, was not Tavor's way. So now we have confirmation within a couple of lines of who spoke. I've been quite public in admitting that there are times, Mr. Erikson, when you withhold who is speaking for so long that I then have to, once I find out, I have to go back to the start to reread the section. Because although it is very clear in your mind, I, for whatever reason, have not picked up on those clues. And so I have to reread the section. But here, because it's so close to the top, it gives that same dynamic of, you don't have enter, said Tavor, snarkily, as she was putting on her armor. You don't spell it all the way out. You've given
also, I couldn't do that anyways, because that would be her point of view. We'd be already in the tent, and I want our point of view to walk into the tent.
So it's there are some times when I just, for the love of God, couldn't you have put that information a wee bit higher up? But but this I like. But this is the same technique. This is exactly the same technique. Except this is an example of when I really, really like it. So, I'm not criticizing the technique, Steve.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine with you. I don't disagree with that. There are times I'm too coy by far.
But also, there's an interesting little line here. Just I know we're going to skip. I think we'll skip through a lot of this stuff to trying to get down to the meatier bits of what we're building towards. But where he's we have the line, "I've just come from the Fist tent. A cutter and a healer were summoned at once." And this is one of those moments that's actually a world building moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the things that I liked about the Malazan world. You have mundane healers called cutters, the surgeons who deal with the triaging of wounds and things like that, as well as someone who is a healer who is obviously magical, so dental or various other magic types that they're using to heal. And I like that inclusion as multiple ways to do things. Just because magic exists doesn't stop other practices.
Yeah. And of course, this answers, Gamut's wild ride the previous night. So, and of course, it's Tavor putting on her armor, because the armor is going to be crucial to all. I mean, it's crucial to the whole thematic elements of the story. And if you think of, I mean, I've always held that Tavor was the most constrained character I've written for this series, that I gave almost nothing away until the very end of the series. But here's one instance where there's a little crack, because she actually mourns Gamut's death. But then she shuts the door on Keneb and kicks him out. So that's fairly consistent with the war.
So there's a structural point I want to make here, but I'll do this other point first, which is I really like the fact that Keneb lies to her. So she's getting ready into her armor. She's going out to battle. Keneb has gone in, and he's going to have to tell her that her old friend, her old guard, is dead right before she goes into battle. So he has to tell her this, but what's he going to say? Oh, he had a blood clot, collapsed in his tent, face down, probably in a pool of vomit. He's not going to give that away. He goes, yeah, he died in his sleep. It was gentle. It was nice to soften the information as much as possible, because she needs to focus on the coming conflict with Shaik. And this is already a burden. And I like that he lies to her. And we know he lies to her because we got that scene of Keneb, of Gamut dying.
And this foreshadows the decision that Lostera and Topper make. So I've already set the pattern of, or I'm setting the pattern of people not giving Tavor brutal truths, if you will. And that there's that constant sort of holding things back and holding things away. And so it's set here. It's definitely set up here. Yeah.
But one of the nice things about this is they're not lying to her out of malice.
No.
It's the half lie or the half truth out of kindness, out of empathy, out of sympathy, which is, a much softer thing that we have seen in comparison, say, to Shaik's camp and the lies, the malicious lies that get told there, the brutal lies there. That here, this gives you a sense of Tavor is respected, even if we haven't gotten her point of view, if we haven't experienced a lot of these things. That these people have looked at her and they have judged her and gone, no, she's worthy of sympathy, she's worthy of empathy, she's worthy of respect. Whereas when we saw the same thing with Felison, with Shaik, and people talking to her, they were lying because they were scheming. They were lying because they were betraying. So again, it's the same thing, but seen from that slightly different angle. So it's exploring the same thing. Two sisters, people lying to two sisters, but lying for different reasons.
Yeah.
So the structural point I wanted to note here was when Felison, Shaik, is being introduced, she's putting on the armor. When Tavor's introduced, she's putting on the armor. So we have this beautiful mirroring of the two sisters getting ready. in their two camps, of getting the accoutrement on, of getting their sword, everything building to this, that we're seeing that mirror of these two women.
And, you know, we talked about earlier, maybe we didn't, but the whole Western motifs that are present here. And this is, you know, the strapping on of the guns and the gun belts.
Oh,
and I'm going to completely undermine all of that, obviously.
Well, I'd go slightly different on this. In some respects, I see the Western as a modern version of the Greek epics, the Greek myths. So what I'm actually seeing here is Achilles getting ready to fight Hector, that we're getting that scene.
Sure.
And obviously the Western is takes a lot from that heroic storytelling and implants it into this fictionalized, mythologized American West that never actually occurred that way. So although you say Western, I'm actually, particularly because it's in a fantasy setting, I'm immediately going even further back to that idea of the heroes. This, we will fight on behalf of our armies. We are the chosen of our armies. And so the whole of the strapping on of the armor, getting ready for the one-on-one battle, that's a motif going back as far as recorded literature. And then
I would call that's the explicit motif. There's something implicit going on that I literally tip the cowboy hat to with Karsa's ride into the West at the end of the book. So there's both going on. Yeah.
I know, but we see the same thing done time and time again in lots of different genres. So if you think in an action movie where you have that sequence of, let's get ready, and they have that montage of them strapping on the different weapons and pulling on their gloves, and then the helmet comes down and all of it. In superhero movies, like it was one of the awful, it was the Batman one with George Clooney and Alicia Silverstone and what was it, Batman and Robin, when they had this ridiculous over the top montage of all of the different getting ready scenes, of the crash zoom into what they're pulling on and what bit, that it became a parody of exactly this whole thing. So we see this technique done in multiple forms of narrative. So, you know, you can forgive me for not spotting that you were referencing bloody Westerns. It happens everywhere.
Yeah, but my film studies, I studied Westerns. And so, and I know you haven't seen that many, so.
Well, I've, one of the reasons, and we've talked about this before, one of the reasons why in film studies we study Westerns is that was the first major popular genre of film that established a whole language of cinema. So we use it to teach genre. And it's not that Westerns are the only thing that does it. It's everyone at the time was watching Westerns, so all the academics at the time wrote about Westerns because they went, here's this whole language of cinema. This is a way to tell genre stories. So when you study genre as an academic, you constantly go back to Westerns because that's where it all started.
Yeah, and I absolutely love Westerns. So there you go.
Well, I know you do. I've had to watch quite a few because I taught this, but they're not my favorite genre. And I've just lost whatever number of viewers now because I said that.
Yeah, and Tamber clearly understands exactly what's going on, so she's not participating.
Yeah, that was something that there was something being implied there that I didn't quite pick up on at all, which was Tamber saying, like, is the adjunct ready for her to begin her morning practice? And Keneb says, Gamut died last night. I've just informed the adjutant, or the adjunct. The woman's gaze flicked toward the command tent. I see. And in the basin between the two armies, Shaikh now stands, waiting. It occurred to me, lady, that the adjunct might appreciate some help with her armor. To his surprise, she turned back to her tent. Not this morning, Captain. I understand your motives, but no, not this morning. Good day, sir. That, I can't quite unpick that relationship. I get the sense that she does not want to be involved in what Tavor's going through, but I don't know why. Because
No,
I always got this.
It's nothing to do with the battle that's about to occur. It's how Tavor deals with grief, and she does it alone. That's the whole point. And Tambor knows this. And this is if you go throughout the entire series without too many spoilers, this is where, you know, it's really, I guess, first laid out that pay attention to this, because this is how Tavor is going to be. So she is a private person, and even her lover's not there when it comes to these particular issues. So, yeah.
Well, it's, I got that, but that wasn't clear enough for me to pick up on. I got that she didn't want to be there, and I just was then trying to puzzle through the motives for it. But again, that's, personal experience of dealing with things. Sometimes that colors any attempted objective analysis, which is always a problem with analysis. So now that we've talked about Tambor, just on that last bit of the paragraph, you'd mentioned that, Tavor emerges, she's wearing her armor, but you have this distinction. There was no visor covering her eyes. Yeah. Many fighters found their vision too impaired by the slits. And he watched her pause, lifting her gaze to the morning sky for a moment before she strode forward. So you have that very direct contrast to the style of visor. And this is what, we were mentioned at the very, very beginning. She's clear-eyed here in some senses.
Yeah, and there's a practical side, which is if she could see Felissen's eyes, she would recognize them. So,
but I thought it was interesting because we have that mirroring, but again, it's two different sisters, so they are slightly different. So although you mirror it, and we've had this whole thing about vision, it's again emphasizing something slightly different. And I found the irony of the adjunct Tavor being able to see much more clearly, and yet she still doesn't see her sister. She sees only Shaikh. So there are some things that obscure our vision that are not obvious.
No.
So I thought that was a nice implication or subtext.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's an inversion going on between the two sisters, because it is actually Felissen who now is about to see very clearly, but it will be too late.
So the next section is L'Heroique, watching the being very, very close to the goddess Drishna, or the wannabe goddess Drishna, and watching her death. And this is quite surreal, because the tone shifts here quite dramatically. Like, this is a very dark, horror-filled sort of sense, very enclosed, claustrophobic. Whereas before, like we had those, as you were talking about in terms of the Western, the wide open vistas. We've gone from Tavor looking up at this big sky.
Yeah.
The cerulean blues of the sky, and the contrasting neatly with the ochre of the plains, that beautiful natural contrast. And now we're in swirling shadows, skeletal branches, gnarled roots, blackwood forest, that this is much more enclosed, much darker.
And claustrophobic. Yeah.
Claustrophobic, and a completely different feeling to it. Like, this is Mirkwood Forest from Tolkien. This is that kind of swampy darkness, as opposed to the plains of Raraku, Pikachu. So right now that I've pointed that out, like why go for that? Why put it in something so radically different to the setting?
Well, because an internal landscape can be the place that one becomes trapped in, especially in their memories. And so I did not want, she is so driven by those memories that she literally can't see the forest for the trees. So I needed her in a place that was going to entangle her, because that's what she's entangled in, her sense of vengeance regarding her memories. And she's completely trapped in there. And that's why when she starts babbling away, Laura can't figure out what she's talking about, because it's way too internal. This is an internal swamp that she is literally, I guess, drowning in, pretty much.
But this is very much the technique that Stephen R. Donaldson talked about with Covenant. This idea of the fantasy scape being the internal mindscape, and it's been externalized, and that it's been created, and it's to reflect almost like a pathetic fallacy of the character's feelings, that it's reflected in the landscape around them. So I mean, I like how there's that precedent with Donaldson.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, obviously, like other authors have done it before, but it's just I happen to recall Donaldson talking about this as a central tenet of fantasy writing.
Absolutely, and it's that taking the metaphor, making it real. That's what fantasy can do so well, and so why not use it if it's there?
And it's, again, we have this in so many ways. This internal landscape is a contrast to the physical reality, because the swirling shadows when we know it's daytime, the branches and the gnarled roots when we get this idea of the plains or the desert, that it's a forest, and you go, again, the vegetation of a desert is very, very different.
Yep.
But the air was sudden and chill. So both that sensation of the clammy coldness, physical sensation of it, and the coldness of chill, adding into the sight, the sound of all of this, that, again, I like this technique of using multiple senses in description to place me as reader deeper into the scene, rather than that more passive, everything is visual, and then character dialogue is the audio. And you go, this isn't a film. This can do something different to a film, which is it's creating it in my mind, so it can go further than just audio visual information.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is it pronounced hummus or hummus?
Well, it depends if you're eating it or walking on it.
Is it hummus? Is the stuff you walk on?
Yeah, or humus.
Yeah, but it's, again, I try to make it a rule: never make fun of someone for mispronouncing a word, because clearly they've read it, not heard it. And you go, that means that they're reading things outside of, everyday conversation. You go, so never penalize someone for it.
Yeah.
But I still get that slight embarrassment that really I should know these things. But I'm like every other reader. There are words that generally don't come up in my everyday conversations. Necromancer is not one of them.
Really? Boy, you're weird. And this is where, of course, she gets backstabbed, which was foreshadowed, right? So, but it's pretty brutal. It's it doesn't. It's not quick. It's not fast.
But before that, we have Lorik getting stabbed. Stabbed in the back, stabbed almost through the heart, and it's confirmation, yes, he is definitely not human, even though you've already pointed this out. But it shows the competency of the assassins, these Talon, or fake Talon.
Fake Talons, yeah.
That the single stab would have killed a human. He's assumed to be human, and it's so quick, it's so fast. He had no way to defend himself, and he's a powerful high mage.
Oh yeah, yeah. Anybody can go down.
And we again get this sense of power is someone can be incredibly powerful in one way, but weak in another.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter how magically powerful you are if someone shoots you from afar with a crossbow bolt.
Exactly.
So I like in this reality, just because you're very, very powerful doesn't necessarily mean you get plot armor. And someone can be very, very powerful in one way, and then in another confrontation, suddenly be laid low by someone who you would consider far less powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But the context of the situation or how the event unfolded favors the other person. So someone who is very, very good as a soldier in a shield wall may not be very good on a one-on-one fight.
Very true. Yeah. And vice versa. Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing that is constantly shown to us in this series, because quite often in fantasy series we have, oh, this character is an amazing duelist, and you go, great, they're going to be terrible in an army formation though, because they're using like a big two-handed sword. You go, they need 6 feet all around them, whereas you can have a shield wall of a whole load of people with little swords who can just walk forward and stab. But you know, we do get that assumption that just because someone is good with a sword, they would be really good with every situation with a sword, and yet
or big and strong for that matter. You know, I mean, the toughest fencers I've ever faced were women who were like 5'2" and impossible to hit. You know, so yeah.
And I thought it was interesting in this sequence that the natural bonds, the web of vines, the twisted ropes, wrapped like serpents around her torso and neck, all of these things that are binding her, constricting her, go from these very natural images, because we've realized she was Talana Mass. She was part of the earth. That these were things of her own imagining, her own fears, her own hatred, her own anger. That's what's binding her. But Lorik sees through this, and he sees the truth of it, that they are changing into chains, that it's consolidated, that these aren't just binding her, they are imprisoning her. And it's moving from the natural to the language of slavery, the language of imprisonment that we've seen in Karsa's story, that we saw in the prologue with Troll. Everything coming full circle to see it again here.
Yeah. Yeah, so lots of action, and then Osric shows up.
Yeah, I love Lorik twisted his head around, stared upward, and managed a weak smile. Mother. And you go, here is this mage, high mage, and we suddenly get a sense that he has a background like Anamander Rake. He is in disguise. He has been around for centuries, and he's just gotten stabbed, and he's like, oh, this is crap. And it's like, oh, my dad's just shown up. Oh, shit. And it's both the parent arriving to help, but also the reducing of a grown man, thousands of years old, practically an ascendant himself or a god himself. And it's still, that's my dad. And I need help.
And they talk about his room as a kid and the small bed and all the rest. Yeah. But of course, it's the role of the parent that is then denied both Tabor and Felicity. So yeah, it's not the mother who shows up, it's the father, but it's the same role.
Yeah. And again, it's not the horrific death of Drishna, followed by this moment of humor, very, very gentle humor, and of loving parental care, which contrasts, like it's a sharp change of tone. And then we're moving back now into the conflict. So like family being emphasized. Again, a parent who we know has been absent, but still comes back when it's important. And yet we saw Kalava, the story of Kalava, Onrik, and Drishna, all this about missing children, tying back to Memories of Ice, and Kalava throwing kids into a rent and torturing them in Memories of Ice. Talk being tortured by the matron. Silver Fox sucking the life out of the mime. That there are all these different familial relationships explored. And this story is very much about the two sisters.
It is.
Family, both found family in terms of like the band of brothers, the way that we describe, say, the soldiers and the Marine characters. The family sort of camaraderie bond that we see with Mappo and Icarium. That we see all of these bonds of family, these things that bind us together, that regardless of race, species, whatever, that these things are an essential truth of our life. And we see them all in different ways. And we see the positives, we see the negatives. But essentially, to me, a lot of literature is about exploring this human condition, not offering this is the answer, but here are a whole load of different examples, to show us that we can experience and gain more understanding.
Yeah, and with Karsa, you've got the father and the grandfather. So legacies are certainly important.
Yeah, and even Karsa's relationship with his two, it's difficult calling them friends.
Yeah, I know. Companions.
But they're, and then the relationship he builds up with Torvald Nom. Like, these relationships extend in multiple different directions. And that's one of the things that I think is at the heart of this series as we go through, is these relationships are exposed to us, are explored by you for us. And we get the different perspectives on them. And it's not judgmental. It's not didactic and telling us what we must think about these things. It shows us to them. And I think you have a sufficient variety of them to keep engaged with exploring that theme.
Well, one hopes. One hopes.
So
then we switch to a she, and this is probably one of those instances where you would rather I use her name.
No, actually, this one it's quite obvious that because she stumbled. But she stumbled, barely managing to right herself. Behind the iron mesh, she blinked against the hot, close air. All at once, the armor seemed immeasurably heavy. A surge of panic. The sun was roasting her alive beneath these plates of metal. I know this is Felisin before the next line, because Drishna has just died. And this is someone, female, wearing armor. There are only going to be two. And Drishna has just died. So I know which one it is. And then you give us that line, Shaikh halted, full stop. Brief, brutal. The structure mimics the stopping because it's just two words and stop.
Yep.
Struggled to regain control of herself. Myself, God's below, she is gone. And so we have the direct confirmation of what we can surmise from the opening paragraph.
So when she's standing alone in the basin, it's truly alone this time. Yeah. And then it goes to the ridge opposite, a lone figure. So I don't even name her. But then the next line describes how this figure's approaching. And that's what becomes achingly familiar. I suppose it's a choice of tall and hurried. The gate familiar is different from the gate achingly familiar, because now we're getting Felisin is all coming back in full flood.
Yeah. And the ridge behind Tavor. So again, even if someone hadn't spotted that this is Tavor walking down, again, in that next line, you give Tavor's name. So like I'm situated here, I can, we're with Felisin and we're really close to Felisin here because we're right inside the armor with her.
We are as close Yeah, we are as close as we can possibly get. Yeah, I want that sense of almost suffocating inside this armor, because that's what's brought her here.
And then we have that line, that internal monologue of, she is gone, I have been ... abandoned. And the dual meaning here of, yes, she's literally just been abandoned by Drishna, but what started this entire thing, Thelisson's perception that Tavor had abandoned her and sold her into slavery.
Yeah.
That we have that echo. So even though it is directly referencing Drishna, it's thematically tying in to the very start of this character's arc in the prologue of Deadhouse Gates.
And she takes us back there, because then she says, walking towards me is the one who betrayed me, my sister. So yeah.
And then we have her reminiscing, returning to her childhood memories. And
right, which brings you right back to the beginning of the chapter, doesn't it? With the second paragraph, Felicin had been her mother's name. So we're back to the family and her family memories, which is foreshadowed in the opening of the chapter, and then we get to it here. So yeah.
But what I like here is you actually signal in this paragraph almost explicitly what is about to happen.
Yeah.
Because she remembered watching Tavor and Ganos play with wooden swords, beginning on that path to deadly familiarity, to unthinking ease wielding the weight of that weapon. Had the world not changed, had all stood still the way children believed it would, she would have had her turn. The implication being, she's never held a sword in her bloody life.
No, she hasn't.
And we know that both Ganos and Tavor have trained. So in that memory, that childhood memory of them playing, of them training, of them fencing, not only is it a beautiful lost memory, and then she fantasizes about what would have happened had all these things not happened, but we know that she is outmatched and outclassed and has no business standing in armor wielding a weapon.
No.
This is not going to go well for her.
Yeah. But also that everything has changed. The path she, would have longed for or liked, would have wanted for herself, is all been stripped away. And so there's regret. There's regret.
You finish that paragraph with, but she'd never had the chance for that. No chance, in fact, for much of anything that could now return to her. Memories warm and trusting and reassuring.
And then she blames Tavor.
Which, there has been, there are these discussions about could Tavor have done more? And I think it's fairly clear in Deadhouse Gates that Tavor didn't have an option.
No.
But you actually spell it out in Memories of Ice, where they talk about Tavor's options. And it is spelled out that Tavor couldn't have actually done anything more.
Nope.
And we realize that, from Deadhouse Gates, through Memories of Ice, through House of Chains, this is weighing on Tavor. Tavor had a plan. Tavor had tried to save her, and circumstances went against it. And there's a very interesting thing here, which is it mentions she'd never had the chance for that. And back in Gardens of the Moon, when Opon drags Perrin away from Hood's Gate, the god of chance, the god of luck, says that basically someone else is going to have to go there instead of Ganos. And it's going to be someone close to him. And of course, at the time, we're thinking Tattersail, or we're thinking someone physically close to him, or geographically close to him. But suddenly now, she'd never had the chance for that. We get chance being worked in with that dual meaning, reminding us.
I hope so, but I mean, for the most part, that's generally missed.
Oh,
because it's just dropped in, right? I don't use the word chance a lot, and that was kind of the purpose. That when I do use it, there's a reason.
Well, you could have capitalized it. and
Oh,
blamed it on a typo.
yeah, I could have. Yes.
Um,
Yeah, that would work.
and it's Shay could feel the weight of her own weapon dragging hard enough to make her wrist ache. She did not recall unsheathing it. And again, we're so close in here that the weight of the weapon, wrist aching, that these are very physical sensations, giving us that psychic closeness to the perspective.
Yeah, and there's no getting out. I stay with it. So when you're going to do that, you want to keep ringing that bell, so that, you know, if we're seeing through the visor, remind us that we're seeing through the visor, at least, you know, throughout the scene. So again, beyond the mesh and through the slits of the visor.
And that's because beyond the mesh, through the slits of the visor, Tavor strode ever closer, neither speeding up nor slowing. We get the sense of implacability.
Absolutely.
That Tavor is on a mission. She's not hurrying. She's not losing control. She's not in a rage. She's not emotional. And then we have Fellison's assessment. She was lithe, light on her feet, achingly economical. She was, for this moment, perfect. So even looking at her sister coming toward her and struggling with this and all of these emotions flooding back, she's like, damn, my sister's impressive.
Yeah. But she's the only one knowing, right? That's why the blood is so heavy. Between the chain of blood is heavy only for one of them, because the other is unknowing. Yeah.
And I think that this, to me, is one of these, if you forgive the pun, heartbreaking moments.
Meant to be.
Because you have struggled to raise her arms, unthinking of how that motion would be received. And in this moment, again, it's that the reaching out of that moment where Fellison, things could go better for her. We had that moment in Deadhouse Gates when she made the initial deal with Drishna to not just be a vessel. And we saw how Drishna betrayed that. And here we have, she's reaching out to her sister, forgetting that she's holding a sword and therefore raising the weapon.
Yeah.
And we have her internal monologue. Tavor, it's all right. And in that moment, you go, she's forgiven Tavor, or she knows that blood will work it. They can work things out. Things are going to be fine.
Yeah.
And then you sick, evil man.
Yeah. Yeah.
The sword's weight is suddenly gone with this reverberation. Then something punched into her chest, a stunning blossom of cold fire, piercing through flesh, bone, and then she felt a tug from behind, as if something had reached up, clasped her hauberk, and yanked on it. But it was the point. It was just the point, she realized. The point of Tavor's sword as it drove against the underside of the armor shielding her back.
Yeah, right through. So the point of view stays as tight as I can possibly be, and almost reducing everything to her observing the very physicality of what has just happened without the emotional attachment to it, because she's past that already. So, yeah.
And obviously, as she falls and as she dies, to set one boot down hard on her chest, a weight that now it had arrived seemed eternal, and dragged the sword free. So this weight on her chest, and then she has, this is how you break an unbreakable chain, by dying. I just wanted to know, Tavor, why you did it, and why you did not love me when I loved you. I think that's what I wanted to know. The boot lifted from her chest, but she could still feel its weight. Heavy, so very heavy. Oh, mother, look at us now.
Yeah.
And the tragedy of this, the emotional impact is that of tragedy, because even now, after everything, after all that has happened, Fellison still loves her sister. And the pain that she feels is, she felt betrayed, but she's not angry anymore. She doesn't want vengeance anymore. She wants to understand why her sister didn't love her. And you know that if she'd had that chance to talk, Devore would have gone, what are you talking about? Of course I love you. And
yes, of course.
that,
And that sets the seed. I mean, I won't give too much away, but it sets the seed for the entire freaking series, doesn't it? And of course, using, you know, the way the chapter opened with the second paragraph and the mother, it has to come back to that. And so that's where, again, you set things up early in your chapter, and you need to come back to them, because that's your limited palette, you know, in terms of a painting metaphor. But so you got to stick with those. You got to stick with them and make use of them.
But even then, like the multiple readings of, even though the boot weight is taken away, her chest feels heavy. So yes, that's a description of, you know, the dying and the feeling of pressure on your chest, but also the idea of a broken heart, that chest pain, that weight coming from it. Like this is just, it's such a powerful and emotive moment. And so much of it is in that closeness of detail. Because through the visor slit, she stared up at her sister, a figure standing behind a web of black twisted iron wire that now rested cool over her eyes, tickling her lashes. That the incongruity of the feeling of the eyelashes when she's dying, noticing these little moments, the last sensations as she dies. Like, we are so close to this.
Yeah.
The point of view, the perspective is so ingrained in Fellison's perspective that you can't help but feel this emotional punch.
Well, I think that's kind of where the last super close detail I give her, because I go internal monologue at that point. I've just closed the book, so I don't remember. But so once you set that up, then you can go straight into the internal voice and just stay there. You don't have to come back.
Well, you followed up with a figure who now stepped closer to set one boot down hard on her chest, a weight that, now that it had arrived, seemed eternal, and dragged the sword free. Then the internal dialogue monologue happens.
Yeah. So you get the sensation of the eyelashes, which in terms of structure, I'm bringing us to her eyes. And so then the next paragraph, you get to see what she sees. So that's kind of another way of doing transition as well. Yeah.
But I mean, I know that some people feel that because there wasn't a big battle at the end, that this was in some way a letdown. And yet for me, the emotional impact of this, of building up to this, that this is far more impactful than another battle sequence of a whole load of soldiers killing a whole load of other soldiers.
And I knew that once I did Memories of Ice, I mean, Deadhouse Gates ending ratchets things up. Memories of Ice does it even more. And I mean, in a sense, where do you go from there? Well, you can't just keep sort of upping things. We see that happen in, you know, superhero films, and it gets ridiculous, right? Because you just can't keep upping the spectacle. So my decision was to go the opposite way and close focus and keep closing in that focus. And I could see, looking at it now, that I was definitely had that mindful sense of, no, this is going to be as close as I possibly can, right down to her eyelashes. So,
and certainly, I mean, even from a structural perspective for a series, by putting variation in as what is going to happen at the end, the reader gets new things each time and won't always know what to expect. Whereas, you know, there are certain series that when I read, I know in the last X number of pages that a battle is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. That you can see it being set up because that's the technique, that's the structure that particular author employs.
Yeah.
And you go, and you know, that's great. It's fun, it's enjoyable, it's nice knowing what the structure is going to be. But at the same time, it's also nice to have a series where you cannot always predict what's going to happen at the end, or even how that thing is going to happen at the end. It's nice to have an alternative.
And that was the challenge I set for myself, was I did not want the endings to be predictable in that fashion. I wanted to keep wrong-footing the reader as much as I could, but at the same time make it all make sense so that it actually does fit. It's actually appropriate.
Well, and obviously, some readers will respond well to that. Other readers will not enjoy it, because like we all have personal tastes about why we're reading. We see that in reactions to the various books, where someone says, I really like that storyline, but I hated that one. And the person sitting right next to them will say, but I loved that one and hated that one. You can't please all readers all the time. No. And in a 10-book series where you're exploring these different things, I think it's nice that there is a variety, that there's enough complexity and diversity within the narrative that there is something for everyone. And these things are dealt with in such a fashion that they feel complete and satisfying. And yeah, there will be some endings you like better than others, just like there are some films that you like better than others. That's a personal preference. But I think stylistically and structurally, and in terms of writing technique, we have these endings that do provide closure. This is the conclusion of, quite literally the conclusion of Fellowson and her storyline. It is the beginning, really, of Tavor's storyline. So there's a nice balancing there, that there is catharsis in this ending. It may not have been the ending we wanted for Fellowson, but that's, I think, part of the point, in that it's a tragedy. This isn't an epic battle. This is a tragic battle. And it's a subversion of the gunslinger trope, that, it's the two going out and then there's the quick draw and the person falls to the ground. That it's playing with that. It's playing with that we saw when Achilles is summoned out to defeat the hero from the other army. All of those sorts of things. We see this time and time again. And here we have the outmatched child against the professional soldier. And we hoped against hope that it would end differently. And yet it ends predictably. It ends exactly the way that you would expect a child in armor facing a professional soldier to end. So we can finish off just very, very briefly then with your iconic Karsa riding off into the sunset, because
totally. I love that scene. And I do remember people complaining that the first read, like when it first got published, and the first reviews came out, that Karsa's story wasn't, success, it wasn't wrapped up. And of course, I just shook my head, because, that story's not done yet. It's not even close to done yet. So I thought it quite appropriate that he rides off into the freaking sunset. But
the paragraph, Karsa swung about, faced his sword of stone. He then smiled. Yes, I am Karsa Orlong of the Erd, a Tiblor. Witness, my brothers, one day I will be worthy to lead such as you. Witness. Sword once more slung on his back, havoc once more solid beneath him. The Toblikai rode from the shoreline, west, into the wastes. And it's like the Marconi score, the Sergei Leone film of the gunslinger riding out into the distance.
Yeah, I mean, that was slightly mocking, but that's me. But yeah, absolutely.
And yet,
I love that ending. It's perfect for dragging the two heads.
Dragging the two heads behind him. And I will point out here the same thing that I've pointed out to you before. He still doesn't have a scabbard for his sword.
Oh, whatever.
How is it slung on his back? Erikson.
Who knows?
It's magic.
It's all magic, yeah.
Well,
not necessary.
This has been an absolute blast for me. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for agreeing to it.
It's been a lot of fun.
So I will repeat the offer that you so generously made, that if people want to comment about another scene, hope not an entire chapter. This has taken way too long. A specific scene, a specific section. Steve and I will try to do another one of these to go through it, because I think this is a lot of fun, and it's quite interesting to get the slightly different perspectives that we have on it. But
yeah, and I mean it's, I suppose, you know, if you look at it in the long term, it's going to be kind of unusual because, you know, there's a limited duration in terms of, you know, how long I'm here for this. So it's nice to actually get this recorded and get it out there. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, because like I have said many times before, Shakespearean scholars would cut off multiple parts of their anatomy to be able to sit down with Shakespeare in order to ask about these things. That we live in a day and an age when we actually have the opportunity to ask about these things and to get additional perspective, and to talk to authors, to talk to writers, which I just think is an opportunity we should never waste.
Mm.
You know, obviously I'm an oddity on the internet for thinking that.
Yeah, you definitely are. There's a handful of you, as far as I'm aware. Everyone else would rather just sort of put the muzzle on. You know, so.
Well, you know, each to their own. BDSM, you know, if that's what they're into. But Steve, thank you so much for doing this. I really do appreciate it. It's been great. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, cool.
Okay. And it just remains for me to say thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.